Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Great pleasure to have you with us. It is the high-level panel on humanitarian diplomacy, looking into the role and contribution of frontline negotiator to the development of humanitarian diplomacy. So it's a great pleasure to have you all. We have people coming from around the world, and it's quite impressive to see the interest in this event. We see already 240 participants, and then more will come over the coming minutes. I'd like to say just a few words before we move on about who I am. I'm Claude Bruderlein, the director of the program on humanitarian policy and director of the Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation. And I'm here to open this session by explaining very briefly how we will operate and also the objective of the session. We have here two platforms to work with. One is the Zoom platform that you are currently on, and you have a chat function where you can post your questions. We have also a Miro board that is open as a discussion board, and inviting you to join this board. You'll find a link in the chat room where discussion will be conducted and also facilitated by the member of the CCHN staff. So why we're here to connect, to bridge practitioners from the field. Many of them are coming from Kabul, Nigeria, and many locations, with those engaged in humanitarian diplomacy at headquarters, and develop a dialogue about what we can learn from the practices in the field informing humanitarian diplomacy, but also about diplomatic practices, and to see how it could inform frontline negotiation. We've seen over the recent years two worlds, being interdependent, but not necessarily well connected. Humanitarian diplomacy is about positioning at headquarters and in the political capital of the world. And humanitarian negotiation is about, negotiating access, and often working in confidentiality and often in isolation. So what we're trying to do here is to open a channel of communication between the vast number of frontline humanitarian negotiators on which humanitarian action depends for access, with humanitarian diplomats on which the positioning and the values of this sector depends on. So for this, we will have a panel with us, and we're very lucky to have very senior diplomats and representative of the strategic partners of the CCHN. We will have Peter Maurer from the ICRC. We'll have Valérie Garnieri from WFP, Assistant Executive Director. We'll have Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Lisbeth Albrecht, Director General of MSF Switzerland. And we've learned just a few minutes ago that David Harlan will not be present with us, but we have Benjamin Smith who will present his opening remarks. So, but before we move on, we have also practitioners in the field that pre-recorded very short interviews, and we will present this short video of interviews to bring the voice from the field, from these practitioners working currently on the front line. So, and after the video, my colleague, Fiorella Erni, will take on the moderation of this event. So again, welcome, a great pleasure to have you here, and I look forward to a very active discussion on chat, online, and on Miro. Thank you very much. So we'll go with the video.
Throughout my work with the ICRC in the past few years, there has been various humanitarian diplomacy efforts set for influencing the parties for armed conflict and others that has triggered down positive impact on our negotiations in the field level.
My organization has invested a lot to facilitate the negotiation process in the field level by building the capacity of the frontline staffs to train and retrain staffs on the engagement process in the field, building relationship with stakeholders, designing negotiation process. Apart from training staff, there is also discussion with donors on funding, issues relating to negotiation, issues relating to counterterrorism, which is part of our effort for humanitarian diplomacy.
I think in general, negotiation, even though I'm a surgeon, takes place in any facet in detail in life and in also professional life. I remember one particular case, a scenario, an incident that happened some years ago while I was on a mission with ICRC. So there was a devastating explosion where there was a lot of people burned and wounded in an already pre-existing violent and unstable environment. You have to imagine the place was looted, was an almost empty hospital. Apart from many hundreds of patients at the spot, there was no electricity, there was no water. So I made the decision to go, and about 6-7 hours after notification, this decision done by the delegation made us actually land in this particular field. And then I, as one of the medical team members, was in a matter of minutes just involved into explaining the situation to all stakeholders, to both sides, pointed out what was needed, and I absolutely had access to the people and an understanding. But what had been done before by the leading characters of ICRC and the head of delegation was mobilizing the staff, the equipment, the resources within a very short time frame, and also having already the participants or the stakeholders on the spot being informed about that we were coming and what we were doing. So I think it is a good example to just light up to see what in a very limited time frame happened and how diplomatic efforts and humanitarian negotiation in the end very concretely were transformed into a very efficient emergency response.
From the country office down to the regional and to the HQ, there have been an harmonization and discussion going on frequently on what are the strategies that are supposed to be put in place.
Although higher level diplomacy is taking place at the headquarters at the state level, many efforts are set earlier to the stage on the field to shape up the effort for those who represent the field in the headquarters. I do believe that when designing a humanitarian diplomacy effort, there should be an involvement for the field practitioners, especially those having long experience in the field and are able to represent and take decisions.
When you're in the field, those weekly meetings or briefings, basically, they are important. But I do not believe that any expert and any team member needs to at any time give his own statement to a complex issue where you are not as firm as a professional. So I would not ask Peter Maurer to do an amputation. On the other hand, I would not be able to do a leading negotiation with a president of a state.
The HQ sometimes understand how diplomacy should move on. So did they discuss with the frontline staff and see the input that they can add, and with input from the frontline staffs and other from the region and HQ can be harmonized to have a standard tools or position on a specific diplomacy message. A point that I want to make is a recommendation for the international community, international humanitarian community, to look into going down to the field level, because the frontliners today are being trained on how to carry out negotiation, how to do engagement, but the opportunity might not be there. Sometimes it might be very tricky, that because of the structures of maybe the non-state armed groups that are available within a specific context, but also there could be some legislation or that is counterterrorism legislation that is preventing some type of engagement. And this engagement that is not happening is putting the lives of the humanitarian aid workers sometimes at high risk.
The only expectations of the humanitarian diplomacy deployed at high headquarters level is to continue influencing and persuading the decision makers, to facilitate our negotiations in the field, and to ensure our ability to access and to implement our operations. At the same time, to continue involving the field practitioners to contribute and share their views during the humanitarian diplomacy preparations. And we are always expecting that, or we appreciate to hear some feedback on the outcomes of their humanitarian diplomacy negotiations at the higher level.
Many thanks to our communication team and community members for this inspiring contribution. I am Fiorella Erne. I am the Negotiation Support Specialist at the CCHN, and I am responsible for our activities in the Middle East and also our CCHN community in the Middle East. I'm your moderator today, and it is a great honor to be able to facilitate the discussion of this distinguished panel today. As we have heard from Ghadir, the field is very keen to hear what is the outcome of humanitarian diplomacy efforts on the field level. So today we are going to hear from our panelists, and we will hear during the next half an hour the perspectives from the headquarters. I invite our panelists to speak about the overall role of field practitioners in informing and implementing humanitarian diplomacy efforts. Also, if you could share your views on the interdependencies between humanitarian diplomacy and operational negotiation practice around specific issues such as health, refugee movements, protection issues, or food security. We would also like to hear your reflections on how we can better bridge negotiation experiences and tactics in the field with institutional strategies at headquarters. So I can see we are a bit over 250 participants to this event. Therefore, I would like to remind the panelists that you have 5 minutes to speak on these topics so that we can keep a dynamic conversation and give the participants also the opportunity to ask questions in the end. We will take questions from the audience after the panel discussion, after each panelist had the opportunities to speak. But feel free, as Claude mentioned, to already interact in the chat and on the Maurer board. And Ms. Guarnieri, may I give you the floor to present your views and the views of WFP?
Such an important conversation that we're having here today, and I would really thank CCHN for convening this. Humanitarian diplomacy and operational negotiation need to be actively deployed as mutually reinforcing tools that place the rights and the needs of vulnerable people at the center of our actions. And this really requires drawing on and leveraging the experience of field managers, of practitioners, to have that form the basis of identifying trends in diplomacy and negotiation efforts. It's only through a bottom-up understanding of the different operational contexts that we can really be forming a set of institutional positions and red lines. And I would just give an example of Yemen, for instance, one of the largest humanitarian crisis at this point. One of the main risks that we faced in WFP was recognizing that the beneficiary targeting approach needed to be strengthened in order to be truly inclusive of the most vulnerable people. In order to take that forward, there are a set of actions that needed to take place at the country level in terms of working with the community and getting the community acceptance of this need, working with local authorities to ensure that we had the space that we needed to conduct the work that would allow this targeting to take place, but fundamentally also at the global level to be working with member states and some of the actors in the conflict to get that space required for this work to take place and to have ongoing support for the activities without which nothing would be able to happen. So these efforts need to be happening in lockstep. What we find that is in this age of information flow, rapid information flow up and down the line, and phones and information in the hands of all people, it's also more important than ever that the information and messaging is consistent and coherent. Not only is that important for ensuring that you're able to get the work done, get the messages delivered, but there can even be safety and security concerns for the field practitioners if messages delivered at the global level are seen as inconsistent with the principles and practices that are being carried out at the local level. So really important that this is bridged very, very carefully. I think that in the context of the of negotiation strategies, there are some elements that become a little bit more globally contextualized. So we know that there are some countries where humanitarian operations are contingent on engagement with non-state armed actors. This is a situation as we're finding in the Sahel, not just in the Sahel, but there at the moment. There's countries where assertive countries outside the nation are shaping the humanitarian space and influencing our collective ability to reach vulnerable populations. Yemen is a good example of that. And then there's integrated mission contexts where we need to be balancing our operational independence with broader political objectives that are set out by the United Nations and its member states. And Somalia, South Sudan, Central African Republic are examples of this. And from these field-based experiences, we can be using these typologies to inform broader humanitarian diplomacy efforts. So they become ground-up informed, but they also become top-down guided. And this link is absolutely key. And then last, I just wanted to highlight that this also requires to have this seamless flow of information and experiences. It requires some different kind of structures at the headquarters level, both within organizations and among organizations. Within organizations, we've set to do that by establishing a much more formalized access group where we have field level, regional level, and global level colleagues who meet and exchange and share experiences on a real-time basis, and that informs our global humanitarian diplomacy efforts. But I think the effort with CCHN really demonstrates how important this is also across agencies, with the aim of building a culture of consultation with access to online tools and support, standardized training and learning and opportunities. And here I think the role across agencies also becomes essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this contribution, Ms. Guarnieri. And I think it's a very, very nice leading over to our next speaker when we say we need to collaborate across agencies and also establish this culture of consultation, which is really what this panel is also for. We will try again to hand over to Mr. Peter Maurer for our next intervention. Mr. Maurer, please go ahead.
I have listened very carefully to the video, and I have picked up two important strains of words. On the one side, I note that frontline negotiators are interested in diplomacy, influencing actors which are relevant to the field, facilitating the work of frontline negotiators and involve them into the definition of humanitarian diplomacy. And I have also heard the word that it is important to understand each one's role and responsibility. I think frontline negotiators, in the view of me as a humanitarian diplomat, are very much an old profession which has been really focused over the last couple of years through the effort of CCHN to make some of the work that they have done over decades more conscious to both the humanitarian diplomacy community as well as to frontline negotiators. I think in developing tools, methods, define more precisely how they work, frontline negotiation has become an important, recognizable profession for the other profession of humanitarian diplomats. And in your introductory note, you have emphasized a lot the kind of two worlds and tensions which probably and eventually exist between frontline negotiators and humanitarian diplomats. And of course, Valerie in her introduction has already highlighted the importance of fluid communication, which is important between humanitarian diplomacy and frontline negotiators. I think I would like to emphasize that at the end of the day, frontline negotiators and humanitarian diplomats are looking at the same problems, but with very different objectives and with very different lenses. And so the same picture may look very different. They produce different results. Frontline humanitarian diplomats are here to negotiate real spaces for humanitarian action, assistance and protection action, while humanitarian diplomats produce policies, political consensus in respective institutions. And I think it is important, again, to highlight the distinct and different roles and responsibilities that each one have, and to ensure fluid communication from headquarters to field, but also from field to headquarters. And I think that's what we have always tried to do at the ICRC. And if I just read to you what our guidance note for humanitarian diplomacy says, it says that humanitarian diplomacy should always be operationally and legally grounded in experience, evidence, and knowledge, and it is intrinsically linked and connected to frontline negotiation experience. So institutionally, we have recognized that there is a field of interaction, and humanitarian diplomacy must be intrinsically rooted in frontline experience. I think there are a couple of examples which clearly show how this can work well and how this interaction goes well. You know that over the last couple of years, together with MSF, we have pushed a lot on bringing to political realities the issue of attacks on healthcare and healthcare workers. The fact that we were able to bring this issue to the Security Council and other decisive institutions was that we had evidence and knowledge from the field which defined the type and scope of the problem itself. And I think running it as an issue for humanitarian diplomacy and finding some basic consensus then made again necessary that we would concretize the political consensus and translate it into practical tools for people at the front lines, into behavioral guidance for nurses and doctors, into tools on how to self-protect when you are in the field, into guidance tools for interactions with armed actors, state and non-state at front lines. And I think this dialectic and interaction has positively unfolded over the last couple of years. I mentioned a second issue, urban violence and war, and how it has the facts and the knowledge and the pressure on humanitarian frontline negotiators has evolved into policy work on prohibiting or limiting the use of explosive weapons in densely populated area, which has become an important pathway and initiative on humanitarian diplomacy in order to limit the negative impact of use of weapons at front lines, and again, feedback into concrete activities and improvements in the field. I think these interactions is of critical importance. And I mentioned a third example, which was interesting institutionally, that the issue of sexual and gender-based violence has been brought to humanitarian diplomats by frontline negotiators, experiencing that this was the pressure which communities affected by war were bringing to them as a key issue, and it was picked up as a humanitarian diplomacy issue, which we would use different platforms, different institutions. I think in the interaction of humanitarian diplomats and frontline negotiators is of critical importance that we are more granular in understanding what not only the issues are, but what are our influence networks on which we are working. What are the chains of command which are relevant to frontline negotiators and to the actors engaging at front lines? And what are the chains of command deciding political and policy issues in different institutions in which these issues are discussed? And I think understanding better on how then to influence those network of decision makers is of critical importance. I'll stop it here for a beginning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maurer, for your contributions and these very concrete examples, how concerns at the field level have been translated into humanitarian diplomacy efforts and also policy issues. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Lisbeth Albrecht, the Director General of MSF Switzerland, because you have also mentioned a project, namely the protection of healthcare in the field, where the ICRC has collaborated very closely with MSF. Ms. Albrecht, may I give you the floor?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening. First and foremost, thanks to the CCHN team for organizing this indeed very interesting discussion. Many of the points already outlined by Valérie and by Peter are also our main concerns. So the outlined perspective in the introduction kind of mentioned that this humanitarian diplomacy often appears detached from the specific operational goals of an organization. And I think it's also very clear that for all of us, our main concern is actually to assure the contrary. And it is really important for us to move beyond this opposition. Maybe as a side note, but I know there's going to be a specific discussion around this, the term humanitarian diplomacy in itself might actually be contributing to this impression and to the dichotomy. And I have to say that it is a term which is not very commonly used in the organization that I represent here, Médecins Sans Frontières, and it's definitely a subject to a lot of internal debate. Our efforts, or the majority of our efforts in what we, in the so-called humanitarian diplomacy, are also directly linked to our operational engagement and the conditions faced by the crisis-affected populations. So these efforts are mainly about gaining acceptance and securing safe access to populations in need and the populations to us, the humanitarian actors. Accordingly, our engagement in so-called humanitarian diplomacy are primarily fed by these operational considerations, and we try to assure they're always very concretely linked to the field realities. Throughout the years, I think we have come to realize more and more how important it is to build stakeholder relations and networks at all the different levels, and first and foremost by our teams on the ground, our field teams on the ground, to ensure that actually all our efforts are literally grounded in the needs-based reality. And so that can then be raised at regional level and at international level. Us at MSF, for these more efforts at a more global level, we have set up a dedicated team, which we call the MSF Humanitarian Representation Team, or the HRT, which is composed of a dozen of colleagues based around in different cities around the world, such as New York, Washington, Brussels, London, here in Geneva, but also Addis Abeba, Johannesburg, Beijing, Jakarta, and others. And so they have indeed built an impressive network that engages at capital levels, or where these more important political hubs are sitting. Their main function is to relay messages of the organization towards these key political stakeholders. But at the core of their mandate, their function is really to support MSF operations. And that is why, whenever possible, both field and HRT members will work hand in hand in carrying these concerns, which are faced and witnessed by our operational teams, and in negotiating and advocating for very concrete, pragmatic solutions that aim to benefit the affected populations. As Peter highlighted, of course, as part of humanitarian diplomacy efforts, also as much as possible based in the operational needs, MSF also engages extensively in policy dialogue to exert and influence change. Acknowledging that policy frameworks have a direct impact on the way aid is conceptualized and deployed, engaging in policy debate is therefore also a way to address the needs of populations. It might be, of course, in a more indirect manner and with a more mid-term or long-term perspective. Important examples are engaging in counter-terrorism frameworks or in the Nexus debate, which provide a way for us to protect the principled humanitarian actions that we indeed see essential for providing support to populations caught in conflict. Accordingly, our engagement in policy debate is also here always linked to field realities, and how we try to do that in organizational terms is reflected in the way we are internally set up. We have indeed teams in charge of policy, positioning and advocacy, but they always sit for us within the department and the line of operations. We also believe that policy frameworks, that was also already mentioned, are not only the outcomes of debates at international level, but they are actually also shaped in the places where the humanitarian assistance takes place. The way humanitarian aid is conceptualized and designed today in a specific country, let's take the examples also of Yemen, of Nigeria, will have very major implications on the way it is approached in other countries. Certainly, our humanitarian diplomacy efforts, be it for operational or for more policy purposes, are not always a smooth road paved with successes. Navigating these international fora, the international diplomacy landscape is not an easy task for an organization like MSF, where diplomacy is not at the core of our initial culture. We keep learning by doing, and there is certainly a pressing need for humanitarian actors like us to increase their influence, their expertise in influencing these decision makers, whether that would then be through training, peer-to-peer support, or any kind of learning opportunities. We should also proactively expand to a more diverse scope of interlocutors. While China is becoming an essential player along with countries like Russia or Turkey, we know we should as well engage with emerging emerging actors in the humanitarian space, such as the World Bank, or more regional organizations like the African Union, the ASEAN, the IGAD. So overall, scaling up our resources in humanitarian diplomacy is essential. We, of course, think this should be done while keeping true to the core mandate of the humanitarian organization. Our aim at MSF is not to become an army of diplomats. On the contrary, it is very much to make sure that our humanitarian operational leaders become more capable of better navigating this world of international diplomacy, and especially to bring a touch of reality and humanity in the broader political dynamics, while ensuring that the people we aim to serve remain safe, accessible, and front and center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Albrecht, for your contributions and also for bringing up the controversy around the term humanitarian diplomacy and what is the role of humanitarian organization when it comes to humanitarian diplomacy. I also found your point very interesting when you said we need to, as MSF, increase our efforts in humanitarian diplomacy while remaining true to MSF identity. On that note, I would like to hand over to Mr. Filippo Grandi to hear the views from a UNHCR perspective. Mr. Grandi, I give you the floor.
Look, of course, a lot has already been said by Peter, by Lisbeth, by Valerie. I want to start with a little anecdote, and it concerns me. And now the young people have to bear with me because it goes back to prehistory. They were not even born. But I remember I was a young volunteer at the Thai-Cambodian border in the early 80s. Now you have to go back then to a certain context. Cambodia was occupied by the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese in previous years had chased out of Cambodia the previous regime, the Khmer Rouge regime, that was a cruel, genocide-prone regime that had caused the death of millions of Cambodians. However, in fleeing from Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge took with them a lot of civilians, and these people were now refugees, to all intents and purposes, in Thailand. I was working for an NGO, an international NGO. And one day I was a very young volunteer, very young and inexperienced, and I was given the task to bring food to a group of refugees that belonged to the Khmer Rouge, or rather were controlled by the Khmer Rouge faction. And I was told that I had to give this food only to civilians. Of course, I traveled for hours on a little truck with a driver. I found myself in this situation in which, you know, of course, the only people present to receive the food were the Khmer Rouge military in military fatigue. So I was faced with an impossible dilemma. Either, you know, I had no choice, basically. I had to dump the food and go back to our little headquarters in Northeast Thailand. Why do I tell you this anecdote? I tell you this anecdote because clearly what had happened, and I realized it only later, was that there had been some negotiation between my NGO and the aid system and states for this aid to be delivered to refugees that were controlled by a very controversial group. But that negotiation, the result of that were not shared with me as the frontline negotiator that went there and was not empowered to, or not even knowledgeable to conduct a discussion, a negotiation with the field. Now, I realized two things on that eventful day. One, that there is a clear connection between humanitarian diplomacy. I do agree with Lisbeth that the term can be a little bit controversial, but that's what it is, and the field negotiation, and the realities in the field, and the humanitarian world, let's put it that way. And that there was a disconnect, so a connection there, but a disconnect between what had been agreed or discussed and what was the reality on the field. Now, of course, now I am the High Commissioner for Refugees. You know, I don't need to tell you, you all know that from our perspective, of course, often I'm asked the question, you're a protection organization. How is protection done? Protection is essentially a negotiation at all levels, field, capitals, that's what it is. And think of this hyper-politicized context we're working on in the refugee world, disembarkations, access to territory, pursuing family unit, avoiding detention of asylum seeker, maintaining civilian character of refugee settings, shield people from all sorts of violence, and even more topical in the COVID era, negotiate access of refugees, displaced people, to health and other services, to social safety nets in an era of increased poverty for vulnerable groups, and even more so, negotiate to seek solutions to displacement. I give you an example not of 36 years ago, of 10 minutes ago. UNHCR was mentioned in the draft, at least, ceasefire agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, mediated by Russia, as the organization that will oversee the return of all those displaced by that conflict. An incredibly political issue, but also an incredibly humanitarian issue. So we will have to navigate very carefully, both at the political level and at the field level. Now, on that issue, which is the main topic here, just a few words, because it is very important. First of all, I think that at all levels, agencies like mine, like ICRC, like others, that are grounded in, that are custodians of conventions and laws, because we are internationally recognized, mandated custodians, we must make sure that whatever level of negotiation we're grounded in those conventions and laws, not least because they are, of course, the frame of reference, legally speaking, but they were designed back in the 40s, in the 50s, and even before for ICRC. They were designed, I'm sure Peter won't disagree with me, with very practical goals in mind, to facilitate states' observance of this principle, so to remain in line with principle, but also to resolve problems. And straying away from those principles, whatever level you discuss, is actually counterproductive. And we see it on multiple occasions in current situations. Now, I am not so sure that that disconnect that I experienced back in Thailand in the early 80s is so strong now. I think that we have all learned to try to reconcile the two levels much more than back then. And of course, it must be avoided. And I will repeat here to conclude just the couple of points already basically made. The diplomatic effort, if we want to call it like this, must take into account the field realities. And the field realities that are most important are the security of all, the real constraints that people might encounter in implementing a solution. I'm thinking of the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict right now, but also the necessity for those of us who are in the field to remain there. Sometimes, at the political level, things are said and sometimes even decided that may jeopardize the presence in the field. And without presence in the field, nothing will advance. And the field level, and it was said by some in the video, must take into account the political realities. Political realities are not abstract. They are real realities, and funding realities, for example, the things that they may wish to do cannot be matched by adequate resources. And both levels, and I really conclude here, must be absolutely aware that whatever is decided and sometimes said, not or done, said at the capital level, done at the field level, has enormous precedent value. And you have to be careful. So the people like me who lead the organization have to make sure that whatever we decide or do in a field situation has precedent values in terms of access to territory, detention, refoulement of refugees in other contexts, And this is extremely important. And of course, like other speakers before, we have internal mechanisms to try to overcome that. Tensions exist. Tensions are sometimes fueled by public opinion that doesn't see all the subtleties of these situation and would like us to advocate more strongly, where sometimes perhaps that advocacy may be damaging or do right. Therefore, we need to continue to navigate this difficult balance, which I first encountered 36 years ago in the anecdote I told you. Thank you very much.
Very much, Mr. Grandi, for sharing this anecdote with us, and also for this positive outlook that you feel that to date there is probably less disconnect between headquarter and field level, and I'd be curious to explore this more also in the discussion round. But before we come to that, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Benjamin Smith from Humanitarian Dialogue. Mr. Smith, I would like to thank you for filling on such short notice, and I give you the floor to share your views.
Thank you very much, and thank you to CCHN for organising this. And I'd like to start by apologising on behalf of David Harland, who's been called away to an urgent meeting relating to Ethiopia, so he won't be able to attend this meeting. Obviously, I work for the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, and we're a slightly different organisation compared to the other strategic partners. So we're obviously a conflict resolution organisation, private diplomacy outfit, as opposed to a pure humanitarian organisation. So perhaps what we can most usefully do is reflect a little upon some of the lessons from our frontline mediation and negotiation peacemaking, and think about how that could perhaps be applied to humanitarian diplomacy, although obviously we have to do so with great humility, since we do not do humanitarian diplomacy. So you can either take or leave our lessons as you see fit. Now, obviously, we're focused on conflict regions, which in many ways are the sources of a lot of humanitarian crises around the world. So first of all, I'd like to set the scene a little bit about conflict. And conflict has obviously changed a lot in the last few years, and it's more fragmented and more complex than ever before, and it more frequently spills across borders. And at the same time, the traditional diplomacy that was used as part of peacemaking is now failing. So we've seen the return of big power competition, geopolitics has returned, and this has had an effect on weakening the multilateral policy forums, which themselves have obviously been previously important venues for humanitarian diplomacy. And obviously humanitarian diplomacy is focused traditionally on advocacy to achieve its objectives, but in today's world, we would argue there's far less unanimity around key norms and principles. So with all of this in mind, we could perhaps suggest that there's room to, whilst not discarding the sort of new humanitarian, the typical humanitarian diplomacy approaches that are focused on policy fora and broad appeals to common principles, we wonder whether there could be some more room for the sort of pragmatic, interest-based approaches that we use regularly in the field to broker agreements. And what I mean here is really the sort of approaches that are grounded in a very strong political analysis that really understands the interests that underpin the positions of the counterparts that we're dealing with. And anyone who's worked in negotiation or mediation understands the very basic tool of understanding the interests as opposed to the positions of those you're dealing with, and using that to achieve the objectives that you're seeking. We would also argue there's a need to engage more meaningfully with non-state armed actors that control territory. So these actors currently sit in a bit of a legal grey area, which makes it very difficult to engage with them at a high level for both countries and for multilateral organizations. And there's sort of a bit of a question mark, the extent to which IHL and human rights law, international human rights law, can be applied to them. So this is something that's actually a new area of interest for HD. And we're producing a paper on this to ignite debate, but certainly engaging with these non-state armed actors that control territory could be an important area for both our peacemaking work and humanitarian diplomacy moving forward. I mentioned the fragmentation of conflict, and certainly nowadays a lot of conflict parties resemble loose-knit networks rather than hierarchical structures. So when we're looking at engaging with these actors for humanitarian outcomes, there's a need to obviously engage at all levels beyond just the national leadership level. And that's something that we've certainly embraced with our frontline peacemaking. And perhaps there's room for humanitarian diplomacy to move beyond national leadership sort of levels and engage at all levels as well. One of the big lessons for peacemaking, one of the big success stories, I would argue, in the last few years has been the success of insider mediators. So these are mediators who are linked in some way to the conflict, may belong to the same ethnic groups, or have some sort of legitimacy and access with the conflict parties themselves. This sort of legitimacy and access that they bring to frontline peacemaking could perhaps also be applied to humanitarian diplomacy. Maybe there's ways in which the sort of humanitarian diplomatic equivalents of insider mediators could be used to strengthen access and legitimacy and achieve the objectives that are trying to be achieved with humanitarian diplomacy. And the last point I'd like to make is really around the role of technology. So this is something we're getting to grips with our frontline peacemakers, and that's technology can obviously act as a venue for conflict. You think of cyber warfare. It can act as a conflict driver. A lot of the social media we see as being a forum for hate speech or the sorts of outreach that actually drives conflict. And finally, we're starting to embrace it as a conflict resolution tool. And I'm sure that humanitarian diplomacy is doing this to some extent, but the ability to embrace technology's potential, and I'm thinking about big data analysis or outreach through social media, I think the future for all of our fields really lies to some extent in this. And there is also obviously the question of the humanitarian impact of conflict that takes place in the virtual world, and how much the humanitarian actors and humanitarian diplomacy is really coming to grips with that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Smith, for presenting these views, your views, and of course also the views of humanitarian dialogue. And your point about fragmentations of the conflict and that we have to engage at all levels has been something that has, of course, been echoed also by all your colleagues. We will now open the floor for discussions, and I see that our chat and our mirror board is very busy. First of all, I would like to come to a point that is related to security, as it has been mentioned by most of the speakers. Ms. Guarnieri, you spoke about we need a coherent messaging to make sure that our staff in the field are also secure. Mr. Maurer, you said we need a fluent communication to protect our teams in the field. Also, Ms. Albrecht mentioned that security in the field is at heart of everyone. And Ms. Grandi, you said, well, the people, they have to stay in the field. So of course, security is very close to our heart. So first of all, I would like to give the floor to Ennio, who had a very interesting question with regards to security in the field. And he would like to ask this question to Ms. Guarnieri from WFP. Ennio, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Fiorella. You can hear me, right?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the points made by all the panelists. So I was just wondering on one specific aspect, again, related to security, because that is also part of the work I'm involved in. And I think at the high level, at the HQ humanitarian diplomacy level, right, we often aim at resolving the big picture problems. And so in the same way where, you know, countries, you know, conduct diplomacy, we sometimes have some tools to break deadlocks or to trigger responses that can be perceived as quite, you know, strong or abrupt, like, you know, pulling out an ambassador, or in the humanitarian sector, it would be maybe a public denunciation of a government's action, or withdrawal from a country, cutting funding, you name it. Now, at the field level, however, when it comes to the frontline negotiator, especially with CCHN, we often preach that humanitarian negotiation is mainly a process of relationship building, trust building, and so on, and getting to know each other. And there we may not have the same level of authority when resolving deadlocks. And that is why we really rely on this relationship that is built over time with interlocutors at the field level, which then most of the time, let's say if we talk about conflict zones, could be, soldiers, a commander in a remote area, and so on. Now, what I have personally experienced is that when very strong action was taken at the high level, at the very political HQ or country level, and I think it's interesting what Ms. Garnieri said, right? That it's all about mutually reinforcing each other's positions. And then Mr. Grandi also mentioned about, sometimes this lack of knowledge transfer of what happened at, the country level or the higher level, and then, transferring this knowledge to the field practitioner. And so what I experienced is that, the field practitioners, the frontline negotiators were not aware of the reason behind the very strong political action, and therefore were also not able to explain it to their frontline interlocutor, who then again, in some situations would have reacted in an aggressive way, and then that relationship that was built over a lot of time would have been jeopardized. So my question more specifically would be, how can high-level humanitarian diplomacy take field-level repercussions such as, adverse security repercussions into account? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ennio. Ms. Guarnieri, would you be happy to give your views on this question of Ennio?
Yes, sure. I think it's a very good question, and I think the colleague really laid out some of the challenges, and here keeping the needs of vulnerable people at the center of action, at the center of field negotiation and the center of humanitarian diplomacy is the approach that we take as an operational UN organization. And that presence, and Filippo highlighted that the presence and the ability to stay in the field, in our case, to stay in deliver, to stay and amplify the needs and advocate for the needs is key to that. And that does require that grounding of all global diplomacy efforts in the field realities, field challenges. And I would take it's very rare for us as a global organization present in 80 countries and working not just at the national level, but at the subnational level, the deep field level in many conflict countries with partners. We very rarely take the step of either suspending or withdrawing from operations, suspending assistance. And I touched on Yemen before, and I would highlight the step that we took a year and a half ago to do a targeted suspension of assistance in specific areas of Yemen because we were unable to deliver consistent with humanitarian principles, and to use that temporary suspension then as a vehicle to seek the action and the change that would enable us to deliver in accordance with those principles. And that required, even coming to that discussion and that decision required a lot of engagement with our colleagues and our team at the field level to look at the pros and cons, the security risks and the political risks with taking such an action, but not just with our team. We spoke with partners, the humanitarian coordination system at the country level, but also our global partners at the principles level on down, so that we ensured that our action was understood, was aligned, and and was consistent with the views of the broader community. So these are some of the steps that you need to take when considering these sorts of actions. We need to be very careful and cautious on red lines and what they mean. We need to be consistent in our application of those, but staying, delivering, enabling access by vulnerable people to services, including services that we're providing, is absolutely fundamental to our negotiation at the front lines level and at the global level.
Thank you very much for these elaborations, Ms. Guarnieri. And I see in the chat that we have the Dutch ambassador to the UN with us today, Ms. Nathalie Oleslager. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. You had mentioned in the chat that you would like to ask 2 questions. May I give you the floor to ask your question, Ms. Oleslager?
Thank you. You pronounced my name correct. I hope you can hear me well as well. And thank you so much for the whole panel. It has been inspiring as ever to listen to you, and quite a complicated field and skills that you try to describe, because all of us have been talking about humanitarian diplomacy, but it entails a lot. And as you have briefly described, you didn't have that much time. My intervention actually contains 2 questions, and I wasn't sure to whom I would like to ask those questions, but I think the first one maybe to Mr. Maurer, and the second one is a little bit to all, but maybe you can decide who wants to answer that question. 80% we've learned of the humanitarian crises are related to conflict. And we know that COVID-19 and climate change will lead to extra scarcity and potential new conflicts. The needs will, grow, they will keep on growing, and funding may dwindle. So how can we better work together? Because as was explained very well by the Humanitarian Center for, CHD, you have to influence decision makers, but it's not only the formal religious and political leaders that are in a position to influence. There's a lot more influencers these days, and it's hard maybe to identify them. So my question to Mr. Maurer is, do you also use, like CHD said, social media? How do you identify networks? How do you identify who has influence? And how then do you reach out to these people? How do you build this network to influence people on the ground to be able to do your negotiations? Also, I was wondering, which is more a question to everybody, do you as organizations share this type of knowledge? Do you share networks? Do you share key influencing people so you can approach them with maybe more messaging? Then another question, my second question, is related to access negotiations as a first step of humanitarian diplomacy. But for us, humanitarian diplomacy means more. We see it also as a first step towards peace building. We've been advocating a lot, for instance, for mental health and psychosocial support, because we think that's something that is needed for societies to really work to create peace and to start living together again, forgiving each other, putting somehow the past behind. We've been advocating for it, as most of these organizations know, but we were also wondering how can we use those networks that humanitarian organizations set up, and how can we help influence the influencers to also build back better, to start peace building, but also maybe green, and in that sense address the root causes for conflict, so that we don't stay in a circle of recurrent conflicts. Don't know really who to ask that second question to, but hopefully one of you will want to pick it up. Thank you very much.
Very much for these questions. Maybe we can start with question number 1 for Peter Maurer, and then we will see who would like to intervene on your second question. Mr. Maurer, would you like to answer the question on how organizations identify their networks and stakeholders and who to engage with?
Thanks a lot, Natalie, for the question, and I can only agree with you that there is an intrinsic relationship between operational realities, legal obligations, diplomacy, policy, advocacy, and eventually financing of an organization as you have developed. And in that intrinsic relationship, we are confronted with exploding needs, and therefore, as I understood you, the question is how to influence at the present moment. And I'm a strong advocate for using traditional as well as all new tools available. I mean, traditional tools of diplomacy remain important in terms of networking, finding your ways. We learned that from Frontline as well as from humanitarian diplomacy experience. You build network as you move forward, as you negotiate, and you find out what decision-making processes look like. But it is obvious that in terms of looking at broader decision-making processes in communities in which we operate, we need to be much more granular and use modern technologies, from big data analysis to network analysis, which we can do today, into also using again the experience of frontline negotiators. I give you, just to illustrate an example. I mean, we can do big data analysis, and we can do all kinds of screenings of modern technologies, of influence systems with modern tools. But it is also important to know who are the operators, the larger operators, which count at front lines. And I think it's a challenge for humanitarian diplomacy and frontline negotiators to look at new ways to read their environment, new ways to see who is in the decision-making process, who is an influencer, and how you shape the debate. If I look, for instance, how over the last couple of years we engaged with religious leaders, community leaders, how we have identified them, modern as well as traditional tools of mapping systems of influence is of absolutely critical importance in order to see the connectors and to look at the influencing and decision-making system not as distinct, either happening in the field or at the so-called headquarter level, but we are in a global system in which you can put the screwdriver at very different places once you know where entry points for influences are.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maurer. And I'm being mindful of the time. I see we're already approaching 10:30. I know there was a second question, Ms. Ambassador. Unfortunately, I don't think we will be able to reply to this in this panel, but I invite everyone to stay connected on the Maurer board to continue these very, very interesting discussions. Apologies for that. I would like to come to the end of this panel discussion and this very interesting event on humanitarian diplomacy and how field practices can inform humanitarian diplomacy and vice versa. We would, of course, like to thank our donors who make these events and our work possible. So I would like to thank the Swiss, the Swedish, the Luxembourgish, the Danish, and the German governments who are funding the CCHN. Thanks to all the panelists for your time and for your interesting contributions to this panel. We hope we can take these discussions further during future events. And thanks to all the participants and all the guests we had in this discussion. Thank you for your questions, comments, and we apologize that we have unfortunately not been able to take all your questions. Again, I invite you to stay on the Miro board, to continue chatting with us, and we hope that maybe in the future we might be welcoming some of you to the CCHN community and CCHN network. I would also like to thank the CCHN team who have been doing all the background work for this event. And I would like to wish you all a great day and hope to welcome you to future CCHN events in the future. Thank you very much and goodbye.